We all get told as trainers and coaches about the importance of reps, but in this video, I'm going to tell you about why I don't count reps that my clients do. At least, not always. We'll get to that later. And to do that, I want to sort of explain first with a story. Okay, imagine that your client is doing an exercise. Maybe they're a new client or they're doing a new exercise. Either way, the exercise is novel. They get down in the exercise, let's say it's a pull down, put their hands on the bar. Right before they start to pull, they look up at you and they ask you that magic question that you've been asked many times. And they say, how many reps do I do? And since it's their first time kind of doing the exercise and maybe a guess on the weight, you don't know. You don't know how many reps they're going to do. But there's this weird kind of tension that you feel as the trainer that feels like you have to give a number. So you give a number. Maybe you don't, you personally, but most people I know, myself included, for the longest time, just say 10 or 15 or 20. Instead of, I don't know, because I don't know comes off as I have no idea what I'm doing. But think about it this way. What kind of dynamic does this create? What kind of situation does this create in the client's head? Before they've learned the exercise, before they've actually shown you they're competent at the motion, they've asked you how many reps that they should do, you give them a number and undoubtedly they're going to become attached to that number. I've seen this happen a countless number of times with all different kinds of people. You tell them a number, they become attached to the number and they fixate on the number, and then they basically just do whatever they possibly can to achieve the number rather than having some kind of focus on the skill. So there's this law called Goodhart's Law, and it explains this concept very well. Basically, it says something like, when a measure becomes an outcome, it ceases to become a good measure. And what that actually means in practice is when someone prioritizes the number of reps that they're doing, they forget about the fact that they're supposed to be using a specific technique and performing a specific skill. And the more that you perpetuate this mindset in your client of, I must do a certain number of reps, the more and more they will deprioritize the skill of the motion and pay no attention to their actual execution. What you're also doing when you do this, again, I'm being very specific to context here. I'll talk about a different context in a second. But what you're also doing is you are creating this approach in the client's head that basically says, if I don't get the number, then I failed, right? If I don't get the number of reps, then I failed. And so what you'll start to see happen is, let's say they're doing a biceps curl, and instead of curling the weight, maybe they're supposed to do 10. They get to the 7th, oh no, it starts to slow down. By the 8th, they start to lean back, and then they lean back more, and then they start to toss, right? And so basically, in order to get to the 10th rep, they basically just throw the technique out the window. They throw the goal of the exercise out the window. And so what the goal ultimately should be in these situations is to first educate your client, right? So give a different answer to the question, or maybe even address it before they can even ask the question. They say, how many reps should I do? You say, hey, this is the first time or the first couple times you're doing this exercise. I don't really know how many reps that you're gonna do, right? Maybe draw some kind of parallel to their profession. If they're a doctor, maybe draw the parallel to like the idea that I don't know where my blood pressure will be, in a few hours or even 10 minutes from now after this medication is administered, something like that. Okay, you get my point. And when you educate the client in that way, what you're essentially showing them is, hey, the rep, the number is not the goal. Executing the exercise well is the goal and the priority. Think about it this way. If you're cooking a meal, right? And you don't even know what the ingredients are, it makes no sense to ask the question, how many minutes do I cook this thing? You first have to gather the ingredients, put them together in the right amounts, and then worry about, okay, how long should I cook this thing? So I hope that makes sense. Now, what is the context in which this doesn't really make sense? Well, it wouldn't make sense if the person already knew the motion and you had a long sort of or medium term history of knowing how many reps they have done in prior sessions with different kinds of weights, right? Like you should have hopefully a history of how much weight they've lifted over time in terms of where they started with this exercise X number of weeks ago versus where they are now. So counting reps, at least on behalf of you, the trainer, is important in the sense that You want to be able to track progression over time, but that's only after the point which you've developed the appropriate skill in the client for those reps to matter in the first place, right? Because if you're counting reps, but the quality of those reps is god awful, then you're missing the whole point of doing the exercise. And so something that I think is really important to communicate to the client and just have a conversation like, hey, listen, I care about your education in the weight room as much as your actual progress here, because I want to give you this agency and understanding of your own body and your own situation. The reason that I'm not going to give you a strict number of reps right now is because I need to assess how you're doing the individual reps. And then once we get to a point where you've proven to me that we need to worry about the number of reps, then great. Now, I'm not going to suggest that there aren't certain client situations, certain people who are very, very difficult to deal with, who just are not receptive to any kind of feedback whatsoever. So in those situations, yes, you might have to sort of suck up the superficial representation so as to not sort of anger your client or create an unnecessary amount of tension in the relationship. Now, one more thing that's important to understand is that this conversation, even in those instances where you've developed a good sort of history of progression, these conversations become important to revisit, right? So undoubtedly, many of you have probably had times where, let's say you increase the weight from one session to the next, and all of a sudden the client is no longer able to do the number of reps that they were with the lighter weight, which is obvious to you why that makes sense, but to them it feels like a failure, right? In that instance, you need to essentially revisit and re-educate this conversation to them and say, hey, listen, we used a heavier weight. You can think about this as like us getting used to this new skill. In essence, it's the same, but it's also different because we're using a different amount of force. And given that that's the case, we kind of have to relearn the skill at this weight. And guess what? That is the definition of progress, right? Is basically continuing to learn the new skill as weight and reps go up over time. So this is not a conversation that really ever ends, in my estimation, unless you're someone who coaches like fitness professionals who can conceptualize this on their own. But people will continually revert back to the intuition of, I need to get X number of reps. And as a consequence, they will make that measure the end goal rather than doing the exercise properly. And something that's very helpful for me to communicate with people in my training past who have been super, super attached to numbers and who get like legitimately down on themselves after not having completed the number of reps that I initially suggested, is I will say to this person, hey, listen, you actually got to a point where you couldn't do more reps. And what that means is that you made the muscle really, really tired and fatigued and stimulated. You did a really, really freaking good job. You didn't get the number of reps because you were training hard. And that is my goal for you. So again, of course, everyone is an individual. And of course, at certain points, tracking becomes more necessary and almost imperative in some cases. But I do think that for the vast majority of people, this conversation is one that needs to be had, not just at the outset of them starting exercise to begin with, but also with any new exercise, even if they've been training for a long period of time. And in any instance which you're dealing with clients who tend to sort of move away from the goal of prioritizing the skill and the technique and the quality of the rep before the quantity. So this is the classic, if I had to summarize this video in 3 words, it would be quality over quantity, right? Quantity is irrelevant without some kind of actual basis for that quantity in terms of the direction that it's moving us and our clients. Are you a personal trainer who wants to take the confusion out of coaching forever by learning physics, anatomy, and how to actually apply that in the gym? If you are, my online personal trainer course is the course for you. And if you enjoyed the video that you just watched, you should see the quality of content inside this course. It has hours and hours of content specifically on how to coach every single motion that you can possibly coach. With this course, you'll become the trainer that everyone else in the gym wants as their own. So click the link in the description if you're ready to become the best coach at your gym, and I'll see you inside the course where I'll be ready to answer any questions that you have.